Hi, I'm Alex Rothman. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota, and I'm delighted to be able to join you today as part of this virtual conference. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and thank you for spending this time listening to my presentation. And I look forward to talking with everybody during the question and answer session. So, okay, well, let's go to my presentation. Okay. So the title of my talk is Mapping and Leveraging the Determinants of Sustained Behavior Change, 3 Key Challenges. Now, before I get into the specific issues I'd like to talk with you today, I just sort of step back and note that really this is a time of tremendous opportunity for those of us interested in strategies that can help people make and sustain changes in their behavior. I think the evidence is pretty clear that behavioral practices have important implications for health. And we've seen this in a variety of ways. You can see that on the right, the figure illustrates the contribution of the behavior to premature death. And on the left is some data that looks at sort of what is the impact of people who engage in sort of 0, 1 to 5 low risk lifestyle behaviors. And so we sort of have clear evidence that sort of engaging in certain patterns of behavior has a positive effect on the sort of quality and quantity of people's lives. But the challenge for us is, well, how do we help people initiate and maintain changes in those behaviors? And that's really, I think, the focus in many ways of this virtual conference. So in my contribution, and in the time I have today, I'd like to touch on a set of issues that I believe need to be addressed if we're going to maximize our progress in promoting sustained behavior change. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we think about the constructs, in particular, the constructs that drive sustained behavior change. And I'm going to sort of talk with you about some importance of making distinctions in how we think about those constructs between 3 different classes, and the importance of developing intervention strategies to modify those different types of targets. And I'll talk to you more about that in a moment. Second, I think we need to be much more clear about what the outcomes are we're trying to achieve. Sort of what is sustained behavior change? What is success at maintenance, and what is failure at maintenance? And then third, I'd like to emphasize what I think is the value of both anticipating and pursuing heterogeneity in our effects, and that there may be real importance to delineating the conditions under which intervention strategies that we use operate, and dealing with that at the outset of our work. And I'll touch on that third. Okay. So now, before I get started, I just want to sort of set a framework here that I'm going to be using for talking about sustained behavior change. And this really is grounded in what's really emerged over the last 10 to 15 years, which is this set of tools and frameworks designed to support the testing of behavior change interventions. And you may be familiar with some of these or all of these already, but let me just quickly sort of note, here are some different frameworks that have emerged over this period of time. In the upper left, you'll see the Science of Behavior Change initiative from NIH. On the right is the Orbit model developed by Susan Chakowski and her colleagues. In the bottom right is Linda Collins's multi-phase optimization strategy, or MOST. And in the bottom left is the Theory and Techniques tool led by Susan Mickey and her colleagues. And although there are some differences between these different frameworks, they all are grounded on what I would call a mechanistic approach to behavior change. That is, they all emphasize that intervention development and testing depends critically on mapping and testing the mechanism or mechanisms that are theorized to underlie an intervention's effectiveness. And I sort of would suggest that this broader sort of underlying framework could be described as with the term the experimental medicine approach, a term that the Science of Behavior Change group uses, and that my colleagues Pascal Sharon and Bill Klein and I have used. And what a key facet of this approach is the recognition that intervention effects are a function of 2 change processes, what we call the validity path and the engagement path. So the validity path, which is on the right of the screen, represents a target or mechanism of action's ability to elicit a change in behavior. Okay. And then the engagement path on the left represents the intervention or intervention technique's ability to elicit a change in that putative target. Thus, an intervention's effectiveness is predicated on its ability to engage a valid target. If we identify a poor or invalid target, or we rely on a strategy that fails to engage a target, will result in an ineffective intervention. Although discussions of the experimental medicine approach and particularly in the rest of my presentation, are going to rely on these simplified models with a single target or single intervention. I want to just note that it can be applied to situations that are more complex. And so with more than one target as well as more than one intervention strategy. So up on the left, you might see here, just to illustrate, to have this in the back of your mind, an intervention might be designed to engage with 2 targets that are critical. Or an intervention may be comprised of different components, each of which is designed to engage with a particular target. More than anything, I just want to have this complexity in the back of your mind as you hear the rest of my presentation. I'm happy to talk more about its implications during the question and answer portion. So when you're working within this mechanistic approach to behavior change, the real question is sort of which constructs have been shown to be valid targets? And now our theories are replete with potential constructs that we could go after, but so the critical question is which of those have been shown to be valid? What I'd like to sort of emphasize today is that this question becomes even more complex in the current context and when we're interested in using a mechanistic approach to understand sustained behavior change. Because now the question is which constructs have been shown to be valid targets for the initiation and/or maintenance of behavior change. So just get myself organized here. So the first class of targets is really, get to the next slide here. So I'm going to suggest that what we need to do is we need to distinguish between sort of 3 classes of targets. And on this slide, I show you what I think is the first class of targets, which is I've termed initiation targets. These are constructs that when engaged, elicit initial changes in behavior. Now, recognizing that the specific targets may potentially vary across behavioral domains, eating, activity, sleep, smoking, to name but a few, reviews of the literature have suggested a number of potential candidates. And these are things my guess is many of you are familiar with. So outcome expectations, intentions, goals that people set, their self-efficacy for engaging in a particular task. The key thesis here is that these targets primarily have their impact through their ability to support the initiation of behavior change. That's why we would engage them. And to the extent that they maintain change, it's through their effect on that initial behavior change, sort of documented in the boxes and arrows on your screen. Now, a second class of targets is what I would call initiation and maintenance targets. These are constructs that, when engaged, are hypothesized to elicit initial changes in behavior. So that's similar to the initiation targets, but they also separately can support maintain changes in behavior. Okay, so these are targets that, when engaged, actually have contributions to both outcomes. And here, reviews of the literature have at least identified potential targets as well. So it might be sort of people's ability to engage in self-monitoring and develop and respond to feedback on their behavior. It could be their ability to enjoy the behavior, or perhaps the access or availability of material resources. Here again, the key thesis is that engaging in these targets serves to support people as they initiate changes in their behavior and as they strive to maintain those changes, although the magnitude of their contribution to those 2 outcomes might vary. So there might be some of these targets, although they contribute to both outcomes, some of them may have slightly more of an effect on maintenance, some of them might have slightly more of an effect on initiation. The third target, and what is sort of depicted in the screen with the orange, is the class of targets comprised of what I'll call maintenance targets. These are constructs that, when engaged, are hypothesized to underlie or support maintain changes in behavior. Now, they could be attributes, thoughts, feelings, or skills that emerge from engaging in those behaviors, or they could be attributes that are uniquely applicable to the tasks associated with maintenance. Here, reviews of the literature have identified a number of potential candidates, albeit a smaller set. However, these are, I think, actually constructs that we've heard discussed in a number of the presentations during this conference. So autonomous motivation, routines or habits, identity, and perhaps people's satisfaction with the outcomes afforded by their behavior. Again, the key thesis here is that engaging these targets serves to support people as they strive to maintain changes in their behavior. Now, I've suggested, and there's been some suggestion in the literature, of the idea of sorting these targets into these 3 different buckets. The challenge before us, though, is to develop the evidence base to actually support these classifications. So we know quite a bit about the idea that targets might support initiation, but we don't really know much about sort of the degree to which targets differentially contribute to these different outcomes. Moreover, we know even within these buckets, we also don't know about which of these targets are actually the most promising targets to support the different outcomes that we're interested in. And so there's really quite a bit of work to do. And I would suggest that sort of at least using this framework of thinking about these targets as within these different classes is an important and useful next step to advancing our work in this area. However, However, identifying potential classes of valid targets is necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? So we need to identify and develop intervention techniques that effectively and hopefully efficiently can engage with these targets, right? So we may be able to identify valid targets, but now we need to actually engage with those targets. At present, our behavior change toolbox is really actually, from one vantage point, quite full. Susan Mickey and her colleagues have identified 93 distinct behavior change techniques that are in this toolbox. However, it's important to remember that we need intervention techniques that engage targets across all three of these classes. And perhaps not surprisingly, the techniques that have been developed have been primarily focused on engaging with initiation targets. In some sense, we've been focused on those targets, and primarily I would like to suggest we've really focused on developing strategies that engage with those targets. Let me just give you a quick illustration of this state of affairs. And these are data from a review led by my colleague Pascal Sheeran. And this was focused on a review of intervention trials to promote physical activity with people who have survived cancer. And in particular, these were trials that had at least 2 measures of physical activity after the intervention so that they could look at sort of initiation and maintenance of activity. What I want to do today is just sort of focus you on just a small slice of the data. And this is just a window into what were the techniques actually used in these trials. And Pascal and his colleagues sort of were able to sort of identify sort of 3 different sets of potential techniques that map onto the 3 sets of targets I just talked about, right? So you have at the top of this graph techniques for initiation. In the middle is techniques for initiation and maintenance, and at the bottom are techniques for maintenance. And what this bar graph represents is what it shows is sort of the further the black line goes to the right, it shows the greater percentage of trials that actually included the particular technique. And what I hope you can sort of quickly see is not only that there were across these trials many more techniques for initiation used than the other 2, they were also just used much more frequently, right? So the greater preponderance of trials included techniques for initiation. And maybe what I'll just sort of emphasize very briefly is to point out that of the 8 techniques for maintenance that could potentially be used in this domain, only 2 of them were used in more than 10% of the trials. 3 of them were hardly used, and 3 of them were never used. And so it's sort of a nice illustration of the fact that although we might be interested in maintenance, we're really less likely to actually in our interventions include techniques for maintenance. Another way of looking at this is just sort of the mean number of techniques included per trial. And what you can see in green is on average, a trial had about 6 different techniques designed to promote initiation, maybe 2 techniques that were in that initiation and maintenance class, and less than 1 technique that we would have put in that maintenance class. Why this is important is that we can't really test the impact of our targets if we don't have or don't use intervention techniques that engage them. So critically, our ability to sort of test that experimental lesson approach requires having both valid targets and having techniques that actually can effectively engage those targets. Let me move now on to my second question I'd like to talk briefly about. So we can have valid targets and we can have techniques that engage those targets, but what's really important in this setting is making sure that we have a clear understanding about what the outcomes are, right? So a critical part of this is, well, what is sustained behavior change? And in particular, how do we operationalize maintenance, success, and failure? Of course, the specific definitions that, behavioral definitions will be tied to the behavioral domain. So how we identify intervention, maintenance success and maintenance failure will obviously be couched within a particular behavioral domain. But I think it's interesting to at least think about whether there are a core set of parameters that can be used to operationalize those outcomes, and 2, recognizing that across behavioral domains, you'll see that there's really actually quite a difference in to the extent to which there is consensus about what defines maintenance success and maintenance failure. And I want to just sort of use 2 examples, smoking cessation and physical activity, to illustrate this point. So smoking cessation is an area where there's actually a considered effort to have a consensus definition of maintenance, which in this case is abstinence. And that's been sort of articulated in the literature. And I've given you a graph from a recent statement of that consensus by Megan Piper and colleagues. What you can see in this is what they've done is they've identified what is the sort of threshold, what indicates successful initiation, and that was a 24-hour quit. And then they have a couple of different ways of operationalizing abstinence, which is the maintenance of behavior change. So in this case, it could be continuous abstinence, which is not smoking, not even a puff since that quit day. Prolonged abstinence, which is not smoking or even a puff after a sort of a grace period that followed that initial 24-hour quit. Or what is called in the smoking area, repeated point prevalence abstinence, which is just as we're looking at sort of particular windows of time, and every time we look, we keep getting reports that you haven't smoked in them. The other thing that in this area researchers have done is they've had consensus about sort of what is considered a lapse, so a slip from maintenance, and in particular, what is considered relapse or maintenance failure. In this case, it would be returning to smoking after abstinence for 7 consecutive days. And so this sort of thinking about this sort of deviation from maintenance, I think is critically important. However, I would like to suggest that in other behavioral domains, for example, in eating and physical activity, there's much less consensus about how to operationalize these variables. Moreover, I think it may even be unclear whether the framework, this sort of relapse framework that's used within domains like smoking cessation even sort of works in these other domains. And just to sort of illustrate these points, I just want to sort of highlight the need for to develop a definition of maintained physical activity. And here I'm going to sort of talk briefly about a paper that's been led by my colleague Genevieve Dunton, where really the argument has been made that we have to develop a consensus definition of maintained physical activity in order to advance progress in research on strategies to promote maintained physical activity. However, when you start to think about how to develop this definition, I think it quickly becomes clear maybe why there isn't consensus, or at least that developing consensus is going to be a challenge. And I just want to highlight a couple of issues. First, one of the questions that quickly emerges is, well, what's the threshold that defines the level of activity that needs to be maintained? So what's the analog in physical activity for that 24-hour initial quit? And should that level be universal? Like 150 minutes of moderate vigorous physical activity per week, or should it be personalized to an individual? Second, how long does someone need to achieve that threshold to be considered to engage in maintenance, right? So in smoking cessation, you had to be quit for 24 hours and then maintenance begins. Can you maintain that 24-hour quit? So what does that look like in physical activity? Could we do the similar thing? The second that somebody hits whatever the target is, are we looking to see, can they maintain engagement with that target? Or is there a duration that needs to be captured there first before we describe it as maintenance? Third, and in my mind, probably the most vexing or challenging aspect is, how do we understand degrees of deviation from that set threshold of physical activity? Sort of what's a physical activity slip or lapse, or what's a physical activity relapse? And here I think what becomes particularly challenging is that in smoking, a slip or a lapse is actually engaging in a particular behavior. Whereas in physical activity, it's the absence of the behavior, right? It's engaging in less physical activity. And so how is that experienced by people? And how do we even think about those deviations, right? So for example, is a drop in activity that might be takes you from, 250 minutes of moderate vigorous physical activity a week to 160 moderate vigorous physical activity per week. Does that drop in minutes a slip, even if the overall level of activity is still above what might be the set threshold of 150. Similarly, sort of what's the duration of that deviation that really matters, right? So what's the sort of physical activity equivalent of smoking for 7 consecutive days, which was marked as a relapse, right? So how long do you need to be engaged in that sort of deviation of activity in order to be deemed a failure at physical activity maintenance? These are really complicated issues, and really the Dunton paper is really a more call for the need for consensus. And really what I want to leave you here more than anything is that we've got to develop consensus definitions of behavioral maintenance in the domains that we work if we really want to successfully sort of develop an evidence base that will help us understand sort of what are the strategies that are going to help people succeed or fail at long-term sustained behavior change, right? So if we got to understand sort of what is success and failure in each of these domains, if we're going to generate an appropriate evidence base. Okay. So now let me just take you finally to my third area that I want to just briefly talk to you about. And here, what I'd like to sort of note is that as we work on understanding sort of the determinants of sustained behavior change, we need to be prepared to embrace the heterogeneity of our effects. And so we're particularly usually interested in interventions that can promote initial changes in behavior and maintain changes in behavior. However, it's become increasingly apparent that our interventions, even those that are shown to be effective, are often marked by substantial heterogeneity in response. And the challenge really is, and this sort of is challenging. We thought that if we could figure out a valid target and we could get a strategy that can engage that target, we thought we were set, right? We would have an effective intervention. And really what we're grappling with now is, well, it works on average, but underneath that average is surprising amounts of heterogeneity. Sort of this validity, this variability in response to treatment can be found in a myriad of domains. I've just highlighted one here. This is from the ADOPT project that I had the pleasure of co-leading with my colleague Paul McLean. And really, more than anything, what I want just to note is that this is an area, and this is adult obesity treatment, that even those treatments that have been shown to be effective are characterized by exceptional variability in response. And that's what these graphs up here just reveal, which is so that even those things that on average work, really underlying it, there's a remarkable amount of variability. Now, this is something that is not just true of adult obesity treatment. And Pascal Sheeran and I sort of reviewed meta-analyses of interventions designed to change health behaviors that were published in 3 leading journals over a 10-year period. We identified 46 of those interventions, meta-analyses. And what did we find was that they all reported effect sizes. So they reported whether they found sort of an overall effectiveness of the intervention. But really what we wanted to sort of focus in on is what was the heterogeneity of the effects that they observed. And what they found is that 38 out of the 46 reported significant heterogeneity in their effects. And this is a graph of the magnitude of that heterogeneity captured by the sort of I-squared value that reflects the variance in true effect size. And what you can see is the median effects, the median I-squared was really quite substantial, about 61%. What's really critical, though, is that across all of these 46 approaches, the intervention, the heterogeneity really was substantial and common, but remained unexplained, right? And so almost none of these meta-analyses were able to actually explain any of the variance captured in the I-squared measure. And what Pascal and I have suggested is that the problem is that most of our work in terms of heterogeneity has been reactive. We're trying to ask ourselves after the fact, what led us to have variability in the outcomes that we're interested in. And to address this, what we have developed is something that we call the operating conditions framework, which really sort of asks us to sort of think about the links between mechanisms for our interventions and the conditions under which those mechanisms operate. And so what the idea here is that when we're thinking about targets of our interventions, we really need to also be thinking about the conditions under which these change processes operate. And so that as we're thinking about what are valid targets, we also need to be thinking about what are possible moderators of that validity. And similarly, as we start to think about strategies that are potentially effective ways of engaging those targets, we need to be thinking about moderators that actually engage, what we call engagement moderators that affect those paths. So very, very sort of briefly, what I want to just note is that the idea here is that what this suggests is that discussions about that validity path that was really focused on whether the mechanism, the target was valid, really now should be a conversation simultaneously about what are valid targets and what are the conditions under which the target is valid. And the idea is to sort of help us think a priori, what are effective strategies and what are the conditions, well, what are effective targets and what are the conditions under which those targets may or may not be related to the outcome. Similarly, we can think about this at the engagement path. And so this is the same sort of approach, which is the idea is that we may want to identify intervention strategies that have potential to elicit changes in those targets. But in doing that, we want to be thinking a priori about the conditions necessary for that intervention target to operate, what we again have been calling engagement moderators. Now, the challenge is that we really know very, very, very little about sort of engagement moderators or validity moderators, right? So Pascal Sheeran and I sort of went back to those 46 meta-analyses that we had looked at. These were meta-analyses of behavior change interventions, and none of them reported any evidence for any validity moderators or engagement moderators. We've now looked sort of broader in the literature, and that's what this table illustrates. And more than anything, what I want you to take away at this moment is that what we know about engagement moderation and validity moderation is at best idiosyncratic. It just happens to be sort of effects that have emerged. Now, this is thinking about this just very generally. This is critically going to be an issue when we start to think about the sort of operation of targets for initiation and targets for maintenance, right? So this is just in general. We know very little about the factors that may moderate the effect of targets on outcomes and the effect of engagement intervention techniques and their ability to engage targets. We need to think more generally as we think about that in the context of sustained behavior change. This is even going to be a more vexing challenge that I think we're going to need to be prepared to grapple with. So finally, what I'd like to suggest is that if we situate our efforts within this sort of mechanistic approach to behavior change, right? So if we think about sort of our efforts to promote sustained behavior change as our ability to promote initial change and then maintain that change, and to think about sort of the targets and the strategies that we need to use to affect those outcomes, I think to make that be a successful outcome, we need to grapple with three key challenges. We need to specify distinctions between three classes of targets: initiation targets, maintenance targets, and initiation and maintenance targets. I'd like to suggest we really need to have consensus regarding our outcomes. We need to operationalize behavioral maintenance and success and behavioral maintenance failure. And third, we need to prioritize delineating both why and when our intervention techniques operate. I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and I look forward to the conversation during the Q&A. Thank you.